Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable, the windows are shut, and you're settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're doing something therapeutic, combining the calming sound of a thunderstorm with 8 of our most unsettling, long-form stories of haunted backroads, demonic encounters, and deep woods dread. It's the perfect bedtime story for those of us who find peace in the dark things. If this fusion of fear and relaxation is your kind of therapy, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more long nights of narrative terror. Now, let the rain wash over you, and let the first story take you far away. Story 1. It was past 2 in the morning when the detour sign finally broke my sleep cycle. Not a real detour, just a temporary one. A small, hand-painted wooden arrow pointing down some forgotten, muddy county road in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. I had been rolling through darkness, running hard on fumes and stale coffee for the better part of 14 hours, pushing to make a ridiculous deadline for a grocery delivery in Cincinnati. I should have stopped 3 hours earlier, but when a dispatcher gets jumpy about perishable goods, you just keep the pedal down. The rain had started sometime after midnight, a slow, drumming percussion that became my unintended lullaby. A sound I found weirdly soothing in the isolation of the cab, miles of soybean fields passing by in a constant low-light blur. At first, the sign wasn't appealing, but the main interstate it diverted off had a stretch of nasty accidents the news had warned about. The sign promised a 10-mile shortcut around the blockage. I knew better about shortcuts in the rural Midwest, but my body felt like it was dissolving into the driver's seat, and the promise of shaving off even 30 minutes seemed godsend. I checked my mirrors, flicked the turn signal, and eased the 10-ton rig off the smooth highway onto the crumbling asphalt scar officially labeled CR 224, or Creek Road as my GPS humorously labeled it before it immediately lost signal. The moment my tires connected with the secondary road, the quality of the rain changed too. It went from a lazy drum to a thick, driving, purposeful sheet, the kind that forces you to lower your brights just to keep seeing the yellow centerline, which was faded, old, and cracked, anyway. This road was dark. I mean truly dark. No streetlights for miles. The trees, old oaks and weeping willows, grew right up against the edge of the pavement, forming a perpetual tunnel that only let glimpses of the sky through. Not even the lights from the distant farmhouses managed to penetrate this canopy. It was claustrophobic, but I felt relief. At least I wasn't stuck idling on the freeway hoping to pass an accident scene. I rolled down my window an inch to let the cool, earthy smell of wet dirt and pine clear my head, the rain instantly hitting the back of my hand with a startling coldness. I was about 5 minutes down this forgotten stretch when I first saw them. They were small enough that I nearly missed them, but my high beams caught 2 pale, reflective surfaces moving a little too close to the edge of the road, about 100 yards up ahead. It occurred to me that I was probably looking at the reflective trim on someone's raincoat, or maybe just 2 deer. I immediately eased up, letting the truck start to coast. Out here, hitting a deer means not only the loss of the animal but a mountain of paperwork and the guaranteed missing of my deadline. As I got closer, I slowed to perhaps 10 miles an hour, rolling my window back up instinctively. That's when my mind finally engaged with what I was looking at. The 2 pale objects weren't moving. They were 2 figures, perhaps human, but they were definitely reflecting my light in a way that wasn't right. They were perfectly still, positioned right next to an old, splintered mailbox whose painted numbers had long since peeled away. As my truck idled gently closer, I lowered my beams, trying to get a better look, and that's when the terror started. The figures weren't tall. Maybe 5 feet. They were skinny, too skinny, shaped like malnourished kids, wearing what looked like dark, heavy overcoats, the kind people in the 1950s wore. Their backs were to me, the hoods or collars of the coats pulled high against the persistent, heavy rain. Still, they did not move, seemingly immune to the noise and size of the rolling semi-truck bearing down on them. A surge of irritation, mixed with anxiety, hit me. "Move, you idiots," I whispered to the empty cab. But they didn't. No indication they had heard my air brake pressure releasing as I crept by. I laid on the horn, A loud, short blast, enough to wake the dead. Nothing. That settled it. Definitely weird, possibly suicidal folks out for a night walk. I passed them slowly, maybe 3 feet from the edge. As the cab of the truck passed them, and then the length of the trailer, I looked into the side mirror, expecting to see them jump back or turn to flip me off, furious that I had woken them out of their frozen reverie. I saw neither movement nor fury. I didn't see a back either. Instead, what reflected back into my mirror were their faces. Or where their faces should have been. The figure closest to my truck had turned its head completely as I passed, and yet, there was no definition of a nose, eyes, or mouth, just a singular, vast, white surface. No features. It was utterly blank, a featureless canvas reflecting the truck's light, and yet I knew it was looking at me. That was the moment my gut cramped into a knot of freezing terror that immediately replaced all my irritation and doubt. I slammed the gas pedal down, the big engine revving hard, and the trailer tires sliding slightly on the newly wet asphalt. I was done with CR224. Done with the shortcut. I didn't breathe until I had hit 70 miles per hour, my foot pushing the accelerator through the rusted floorboards of the cab. I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. The white, blank face of that figure was seared into my retina, and I kept driving, refusing to slow down, refusing to look back. About 10 full minutes had passed. Sweat mixed with the cold air and the chill from the rain. I finally had to ease up on the speed because this old road wasn't built for a truck doing 3-digit speeds. As I slowed, I peered ahead through the wall of rain, trying to judge where the main highway reconnected. And that's when I saw them again. 2 figures. Parked next to an old, leaning telephone pole. Positioned just like the last two. Too small, too still. Wearing the same dark, archaic clothes, hoods pulled up. But now they weren't facing the road. They were facing into the field, their backs to me. Had I driven in a circle? Impossible. The highway would have shown up on the GPS reboot attempt I had just made. My fingers were slick on the steering wheel. My heart was knocking against my ribs like an angry fist. I must be hallucinating from fatigue. That was the only logical answer. A road crew had set up dummies in rain gear, and the reflection had just fooled me in the heavy rain. I tried for a laugh, but it stuck inside my throat. This time, I didn't slow down. I held the truck steady at 55 miles per hour and drove directly at the figures, laying on the horn blast continuously, hoping they would scatter or move or just not be there. As I passed the pole, I kept my eyes locked on the side mirror, expecting the same blank, terrifying face. I saw the backs of their heads again, completely motionless. But this time things changed. As the long trailer passed the figures, both smaller forms turned very sharply and simultaneously towards the passing vehicle, not swiveling with the motion, but sharply turning their necks at impossible angles. And then I heard it. Clear through the thick, waterproof layer of the truck's windshield and the torrential deluge of sound from the storm, I heard what sounded like faint, repetitive knocking. Not on the window. Not on the body of the truck. It sounded like they were tapping on the rear axle housing or the storage compartments beneath the trailer. A series of short, quick, rhythmic raps. As quickly as I heard it, I lost it in the thrum of the engine and the thunder of the storm. I checked the rearview again, just getting glimpses of their receding forms in the mirror's distortion, still standing by themselves. Still looking at me. I drove another 5 miles, my breath ragged. I just had to get to the main road. The knocking sound was replaced by the pounding of rain, but the image of those two small, pale-faced figures was the only thing I could see. I pressed the accelerator harder, the cab vibrating with power. I was near the end, I could feel it, where the pavement changed quality and met back up with civilization or the highway. Then, the brake lights went on. Ahead. Not mine. His. The truck was a beat-up Ford pickup, painted rust color, parked right in my lane, effectively blocking the road. A single occupant. A man in a baseball cap was struggling under the downpour, pointing a large, multi-cell flashlight at the hood of his truck like he was trying to inspect it. He looked like he was having significant engine trouble. Just what I needed. Not only was the road blocked, but the man had clearly seen me coming too fast out of the long darkness. I pulled my air brakes hard, the semi-trailer groaning as I slid to a stop, perhaps 20 feet from the back of the dilapidated Ford. I instinctively reached for the CB radio mic, intending to offer a quick lift to the next town or call a tow for him, feeling bad that the guy was broken down out here in the storm. I watched the man through my dripping windshield. He was shaking the flashlight angrily, and then he stopped. He stopped struggling with the hood. He just froze, his head lifted, slowly turning to look at my truck. His baseball cap was instantly soaked in the relentless rain. His movement was wrong. Too careful. Too calculated. And then I noticed the familiar clothes. Those same high, dark collars. The same dark, heavy, outdated rain gear. He was too tall for the figures I had passed, but something about his posture, how he froze, how his eyes weren't meeting mine but were fixed on the bottom of my truck, made my stomach drop with pure glacial clarity. This wasn't a person. This was the entity, or one of them, just taller this time. He took one step away from his truck, towards my large grill, and tilted his head just like the smaller one I had passed half an hour ago. The movements were those of an animatronic attempting a human impression. The fear I felt was crippling. His hand was reaching out, slowly, towards the front bumper of my cab. Not a friendly wave. An inspection. A final touch. And from behind my semi-trailer, from the darkness I had just escaped, I heard them again. The knocking. But this time it wasn't distant or faint. It was right behind me. A series of rap, rap, on the steel of my truck's rear deck plate, followed by a faint, wet scrapee as something began struggling to climb aboard. And the man in the dark coat started moving fast. Not running, but sculling to get to my cab door. I didn't think. I just put the rig in reverse, slamming the gas pedal sideways toward the darkness with the hope that backing up would shake whatever was climbing off the back. I felt the trailer lurch, heard a tremendous clank. From the rear axle, the metallic sound of something heavy being jarred hard and falling to the road. The man on the hood turned his head a quarter rotation, a movement no human neck could manage, and he simply vanished, dissolving into the rain as I tore backward, tires throwing gouts of water and mud against the trees. I backed up fast, my eyes alternating between my rearview mirror and the side view, not looking to see if he was chasing me, but desperate to see where the road ended. Finally, a small, gravel side road, almost overgrown, appeared to my left. Before I could make sense of it, I swung the wheel hard, taking the turn so tight that my trailer tires jumped the small bank and slid into a low ditch, the cab hitting the mud hard. I slammed it into drive and kept the gas down, the powerful semi-engine screaming as it desperately clawed its way out of the ditch and onto the slightly more elevated gravel. This time, I didn't stop until I saw pavement of the main highway. I found it, finally, the smooth, welcoming asphalt a sight for sore eyes. I merged onto the interstate and pushed the truck to a safe 75 miles per hour, my hands sweating, shaking uncontrollably, heart slamming against my ribs. I kept going for another 2 hours without stopping, only pulling over at a well-lit, busy truck stop outside of Columbus. I sat there in the silence, listening to the light remnants of the rain, staring wide-eyed at the cup holder. I still hadn't found the courage to get out of the cab. When I finally eased out to check the whole truck in the morning light, there were no dents, no telltale shadows, just a thick layer of grit and road mud from CR 224 clinging to the side. The only thing I found odd was on the metal plate just above the axle, on the back of the trailer. Embedded in the caked-on mud were two single, small, hand-like prints where the mud was scraped away, revealing clean, unoxidized chrome beneath. These prints were far too small to be from a man, but the way they were spaced, and the depth of the scrape, exactly as if something small but heavy had clung to the bottom of my truck for miles that dark, terrible night. I wiped them away, finished my route, and I quit that job a week later. Now, whenever the rain starts, the sound is no longer soothing. All I hear is that faint, but persistent, rapping sound, wondering where the next group of blank, dark figures will be waiting for me to take the shortcut. Story 2. I work maintenance. Specifically, the kind of maintenance job that most people forget exists until their utility bill suddenly skyrockets. I'm one of the guys who services the cell towers out in the middle of Arizona when the automated monitoring systems flag an issue. Most of the towers I deal with are state-of-the-art aluminum monuments hidden inside fake palm trees or on corporate office rooftops. But the worst ones, the ones with the most trouble, are the relics clinging to their remote desert hillsides. The one that almost broke me entirely sat about an hour due east of Wickenburg, accessible only by a four-wheel drive track that was more sand and sharp rock than actual road. Next to this particular tower, placed on a plateau perhaps 500 feet above the desert floor, was an old, completely decommissioned concrete water tower from the 1930s. It was a classic piece of Depression-era infrastructure, tall, rust-stained, painted a faded gray, and topped with a bulbous, inaccessible tank. It had never been torn down, probably because the effort to do so out here, with nothing but rattlesnakes and stubborn juniper trees for company, would have been more expensive than just letting it stand. It was dead silent out there, not the comforting silence of natural quiet, but a suffocating absence of sound. The kind of place you feel like you shouldn't be for too long. I was called out there late in the afternoon because the radio signal for the closest town, miles away and down, was intermittently dropping. The desert sun was already setting behind the distant mountain ranges, bathing the whole scene in a brutal, burnt orange light that didn't help my nerves. Normally, I didn't mind being out at these sites after dark. Flashlight work is just part of the job, but this place, this specific combination of the functional new tower and the looming, silent relic of the water tower, felt deeply wrong. I set up my halogen light on a portable stand, illuminating the bottom section of the active tower, and started my diagnostics, praying for a simple blown fuse. While I was hooking up the laptop to the diagnostic port, it happened for the first time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clearly identifiable. It sounded like an exhalation, a slow release of air over a smooth stone, or maybe just dry sand shifting with the wind. But I could swear it was right above me. I paused, notebook in hand, and tilted my head up. Nothing but the cell repeater paneling and the last traces of orange light fading into deep blue. The desert was still. The air was dead. Wind, I told myself. The natural acoustics of a big, empty space. However, the exhalation appeared to be coming from the direction of the old water tower. It was perhaps 30 yards away, a massive, unmoving concrete pillar. Impossible for any sound to come from up there unless an animal had somehow made a nest in a hole near the top. I went back to the computer screen, dismissing the shiver running down my spine. The problem wasn't a fuse. It was a deeper, nastier power cycling fault, which meant a few hours of climbing, tracing cables, and probably the necessity of camping out here for the night until I could get a replacement component flown in. Great. I hated these long nights. About an hour later, the diagnosis complete, the darkness was absolute. The cold, dry desert night had wrapped around the high plateau, and my halogen light now fought a losing battle against the shadows cast by the two tall, monolithic structures. I was tightening down a terminal connection at the base of the cell tower when it came again. But this time there was no ambiguity. It was a definite whisper. Low, breathy, like someone was attempting to tell a secret 10 feet away and not succeeding. Stare. That's what it sounded like saying. Just that one syllable. It sounded like it had been scraped across the inside of a stone well. My ears immediately categorized the sound as human, and my immediate reaction was, who the hell else is out here? The closest working ranch was miles away, and this was not a place to walk to after dark. Instinctively, I went for my radio, a simple handheld antenna, to call back to the small maintenance shed I had passed about 15 minutes into the dirt track. I pressed the talk button. Maintenance to shed control, anyone. Is there any active personnel logged into? From the handheld radio itself, a loud, sustained hush sound, static-laced and painfully distorted, overwhelmed my voice. I pulled the radio away from my ear, wincing, then dropped the talk button and waited until silence returned. Nothing. My own heart was drumming so hard I could hear it over the quiet sizzle of the tower's fan. My hands were visibly shaking. I knew for a fact there was no one else within 5 miles. I looked in the direction of the old water tower. Dark. Silent. Looming. I took out my phone. Lost signal, as always. Maybe this was some kind of atmospheric anomaly playing tricks on me. That's what I needed to believe. Logic dictated I needed to stop listening and focus on the job. I had tools scattered on the ground. I needed to pack up and bunker down for the night, try to radio out again in the morning light. As I gathered the heavy wrenches, I heard the whispering again, 3 distinct instances this time, slightly louder, slightly clearer, and unmistakably coming from above me, not the water tower now, but from the top of the active cell tower. I looked up, fighting through the strobe effect of my own halogen light. The top platform was still and empty, just the blinking FAA lights winking crimson. But the sound was coming from right underneath that upper platform. It sounded like the word was being dragged back and forth, over and over. She knows. She knows. Wait, where? This was more than a fluke of sound. It was an echoing, repeating phrase delivered in that same dry, strained gravelly whisper. My flashlight was useless against the darkness and height. I grabbed a thick plastic tool bag. Inside, I always kept a digital voice recorder, originally brought for documenting sound issues with antennas, but now a lifeline, small, silver, and ready. I turned it on, pointed the small microphone grill at the water tower first, then the cell tower, and recorded 60 seconds of the heavy sound of my own shaky breathing, the buzzing of the lights, and the distant, dry whoosh of the air moving over the high metal. Nothing else. Not a sound. The whole situation was too much. The anxiety coiled in my chest, a physical wire twisting into a painful knot. I had to go. Screw the power failure. I packed my bag, quickly, haphazardly, slung the battery pack of the halogen light over my shoulder, and got into the Jeep. I didn't stop to retrace my tracks. I just floored the accelerator, bouncing the old military-grade vehicle over the tire tracks and rocks until I hit the paved road, far away from that monolithic terror. Back in the shed at the bottom of the long hill, I found enough signal on a landline to call in my location but omitted the part about the audio effects. I told them I was too exhausted and the light wasn't good enough. They agreed to send the repair component and a crew in the morning. When done, I grabbed a beer, sat near my still-lit halogen light, and pulled out the small digital voice recorder. I was almost certain I had recorded 30 minutes of silence to confirm the illusion the next day. I hit the play button. What played back was not silence. The first 60 seconds were exactly what I had heard, the sound of a battery-powered fan humming, the sizzling light, and my desperate, thick exhales. Then, right after my 60-second cut-off, just as I had placed the recorder back into the tool bag, a voice became audible. A deep, rasping drawl that cracked like parchment being quickly ripped. It wasn't whispering this time. The man, a low, unnaturally slow-voiced gentleman, was giving a lengthy, detailed account. Not to me. To himself. Or to whoever was listening on the other side of the high platform. The word was not stare anymore. The full phrase repeated once, then twice, chilling me to the core with an intensity that made me think about smashing the small device with a rock. You tell him, son. It doesn't like observers. The watcher says. Water tower stays empty for her. You tell him quick. Now you call it out. Tell him, it never closes its mouth. The voice ended on a strange, wet clicking noise, and then the clip concluded. The remaining 29 minutes were dead silence. I sat there in the desert shack, cold sweat beading on my forehead, still trying to rationalize the auditory event as some complex static feedback trick the cell tower interference network was playing on my cheap recorder. But the voice had used actual words. It had referenced me, the observer, that needed to be told. That small, innocent recorder had captured not a phantom or a ghost, but a dark, specific monologue addressed to the trespasser. I didn't tell the repair crew in the morning what I had heard. I just packed all my things neatly, including the silent voice recorder, and I never took another solo maintenance call to Old Wickenburg's plateau, or any site near an old, empty water tower again. That voice recorder is still in a drawer somewhere, its contents backed up to a corrupted, password-protected file only I still have the decryption key for. I still hear the rain beating down sometimes, and the urge comes up to listen to the watcher on the water tower just one last time. I only ever hear that deep, dry voice from the static repeating two phrases that haunt me to this day. Water tower stays empty for her. And that final, terrifying instruction. It never closes its mouth. Story 3. The old house always smelled of dust and unwashed linen, even before we officially owned it. We bought it for a song, a true architectural masterpiece with 5 fireplaces and an imposing, gray stone facade in the old, moneyed part of coastal New England. It was a steal, largely because every single person in the town of Ipswich avoided it like a plague, calling it a sucker's mistake, and saying it had been waiting for us exactly as long as it had been empty. My wife, Sarah, and I were rational people. We didn't believe in history, only in square footage and property value. Our disbelief only lasted 12 weeks and 3 nights in the house. The locals were wrong. The place wasn't just waiting for us. It was actively waiting to feed. It started with the batteries. A silly thing, really? But deeply unnerving. Sarah was the first to complain, muttering that the brand new box of AA batteries we bought for the remote control candles she loved kept dying with impossible speed. Literally, 12 hours after installing them, they'd be fully drained, dead as a doornail alkaline. I laughed it off as a coincidence. A bad batch, maybe a parasitic drain on the cheap hardware. Then my own tools started succumbing. My expensive headlamp, the one I used for renovations in the dim attic crawl space, had its lithium-ion cell lose power from full to zero in less than a single afternoon. My personal theory was some profound, unshielded electromagnetic interference coming off the old fuse box. The town electrician, a perpetually sweating man named Dale, came by and assured me that the only significant interference was the ghost of logic that dictated the house should have been torn down 30 years ago, then laughed, collected his fee, and fled. We replaced the fuse box the next week. No difference. The battery still withered. The light-up display on our digital alarm clock would go completely dark at exactly 3 a.m., and neither new lights nor new clock radios could hold a charge through the house's extended death grip on all stored energy. As the physical evidence mounted, the atmosphere followed suit. The house was becoming inexplicably darker. I'm not talking about shadows. I mean light itself was being attenuated. Every room, even the high-ceilinged library with 3 enormous south-facing windows, began to feel like twilight just after an eclipse. The natural light simply felt weaker, diffused, and strained. I thought I might need to replace the glass in the windows, thinking it might be a subtle, old oxidation effect. Sarah, who was much less rational than she claimed to be, started keeping every light on the minute the sun touched the horizon. The electrical bill, of course, was astronomical, but the house didn't feel bright. The lights were on, but they felt muffled, muted, and constantly under duress. Now came the 3 nights that changed everything, the nights the house made its preferences known. The first night happened after I finally gave in. After weeks of watching AAA power die on our TV remote every 2 days, I bought a package of 40-watt dim, old-school incandescent bulbs. It was a pointless, desperate, nostalgic act to try a form of light the house couldn't easily defeat. Less light, more heat, more energy hungry. That night, after installing the feeble light in the dining room, I was trying to sleep, listening to the heavy rain beat against the side of the house. I had maybe been asleep for an hour when I was woken up by a sound, the unmistakable clink-clink-clink of a glass chandelier gently swinging, followed by the quiet schmear sound of a heavy body being rapidly dragged over the unfinished wooden floor in the dining room below us. It was heavy, wet, and rhythmic. I sat bolt upright, drenched in cold sweat. Sarah was already awake, clutching the blankets under her chin. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with terror. "Someone's in the house. In the dining room." Logic, once again my desperate ally, demanded I descend immediately, but the sound of that dragging, so wet, so rhythmic, stalled me. I crept out of bed, grabbed the heaviest flashlight I owned, thankfully charged that day outside in my shed, and went to the top of the stairs. I listened harder. Silence. Only the driving rain was audible. I crept down the stairs, adrenaline singing in my veins. The dining room was empty. Furniture placed precisely where we had left it. Not a drop of water. Nothing disturbed. But the light I had installed, the single 40-watt incandescent bulb, was now dark. Dead. I looked closer. Not burned out, but cold. I touched the glass. It registered no residual heat, as if the power had been cut for hours, not minutes. The energy was just gone. The second night was 10 days later. The house was now so dark, even with multiple 100-watt fixtures on, that we had to use auxiliary gas battery-powered lamps for reading. The shadows were thicker, the light felt sick. It occurred to me with absolute clarity that the house was consuming the light. It wasn't a lack of power, it was a poltergeist-level hunger for photon energy. That night, Sarah and I argued in the kitchen, not about the darkness, but about my growing paranoia. She yelled that I was losing it. I yelled back that she was enabling the house. And then, the argument stopped itself. From the attic, the crawl space I had once worked in, there came a noise, distinct from the rain, the slow, measured sound of heavy, dry, rhythmic scraping over the exposed ceiling joists right above our kitchen. It was moving back and forth, dragging whatever it was. And this time, a third party joined the cacophony. A very old, very slow, very high, sing-song giggle. Sarah gripped my arm with impossible strength. That was not human, her eyes screamed. I had no other defense left. I flipped the safety off my shotgun, something I had never thought I'd do, and pointed it at the ceiling. I listened for the scraping and moving object above. And as I waited, the light in the kitchen changed. Slowly. The ceiling fluorescent fixtures, all three of them brand new, started to dim, their white light turning pale yellow, then a dirty, sickly, anemic red. As the red light began to fail, the entire atmosphere changed again. The room, which had been comfortably warm from the baking we were doing, immediately turned glacial cold. When the lights finally gave out with a sad, electrical fizzle and died, the darkness that descended was not the blackness of night. It was an absolute darkness, heavy, physical, like a thick curtain of liquid night falling from the ceiling. A deep, wet gurgling replaced the attic scratching. The third night was the final curtain. Day now felt wrong. Even in the brightest daylight, the house was a repository of shadows. Sarah had left me that morning, driving to stay with her sister in Boston, making it brutally clear I could call her when I tore the house down to the foundation. I was alone, stubbornly doing some renovation work in the living room, trying desperately to introduce some rational, human energy into the core of the house. I replaced the final original chandelier with track lighting, hoping to eliminate a massive light sink. It was almost 9 in the evening, the heavy rain had resumed, and I was sitting heavily in the newly lit, and still dim, living room, watching a terrible old movie on a laptop that used battery power just to survive. The house was silent, but something felt like it was waiting. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it. Then I heard the steps. Not muffled, not whispering, not dragging. They were definite, rhythmic, heavy, stomping footsteps. Coming from the one place left untouched in the entire house, the concrete-floored, cold storage room in the basement. They paced out over the concrete, 1 foot then the next. And they were coming up the stairs. The sound of wood groaning under terrible weight was unavoidable. These were not phantom footsteps. They were physical manifestations of mass and fury, coming up into the main house. I wasn't brave. I was simply resigned. I clutched the shotgun, pointed it at the door to the basement staircase off the kitchen hallway, and waited. The steps were heavy, slow, and determined. When the thing reached the top of the stairs, the door suddenly ballooned into focus for me. Not by sound, but by vision. The light, from the track lighting, from the laptop screen, from my own damn eyes, suddenly converged on that one exit. The light bled toward it, an undeniable beam of photons racing toward that closed pantry door, trying to illuminate whatever was coming. And at that exact moment, every single generator, every single battery, every single light in the entire 6,000 square foot house went completely and totally dark at the same moment. The silence was terrible. The blackness was not real. It was something else. A physical, aggressive darkness that pressed directly onto my eyes. A sensory deprivation so complete I became dizzy and instantly lost my equilibrium. Yet, it was the sound, finally, that sealed my retreat. From only 2 feet in front of me, in the profound, consuming darkness that smelled of fresh paint and old coal smoke, I heard what sounded like heavy, labored inhalation, a deep, raspy wet slurping sound, the sound the creature made as it began, finally, to eat not just the photon energy, but to gorge on the light sources. The thing in our home fed on all electricity, stored charge, chemical reactions, and finally, I was absolutely convinced, the energy of life itself. The sound, that wet slurp of consumption, was moving towards me. I didn't open the door. I didn't look for the light. I just ran. I scrambled and crawled across the floor, through the unseen halls and out the back, throwing myself off the porch and sinking my feet into the cold, soft rain-soaked New England mud, still fighting the oppressive blackness on my vision. I never went back in until the demolition crew did, 5 months later. I didn't see what they found. But I knew this. The house where shadows feed had made it perfectly clear. It would always be dark there. Everything would be dark. Forever. It still is. Story 4. The old house was built without the owner understanding the point of basements. They had dug perhaps 7 feet down, just enough to get past the frost line of the soil, poured a foundation, and stopped right there. This gave us about 4 feet of usable underground space, which my younger brother, Dale, immediately claimed as an apartment when our family moved to a small town in rural Indiana when I was 16. It was less an apartment and more a shallow, damp, semi-finished bunker for a 17-year-old high school kid who hated his parents. Our small, ordinary American house, split level, 3 beds, 2 baths, quickly had a strange, separate identity when it came to Dale. He'd sleep, eat, and breathe down there, only coming up for a stale hamburger patty or a mandatory Sunday dinner. I didn't question it. We were brothers, 2 years apart, and that meant we were permanently dedicated to ignoring each other. But in the spring of '96, the basement started changing my brother, or maybe something down below started wearing my brother as a temporary skin suit. It began subtly, like all the worst terrors do. Dale started losing weight. Not like a teenager naturally thins out, it was gaunt. His cheekbones jutted out from his face in a way they never had before, and his eyes, brown and intense, retreated into deep, charcoal rings from what I assumed was his chronic lack of sleep, likely due to terrible gaming habits. He started spending 36-hour stretches down there without coming up for food, and when I, out of morbid fraternal curiosity, once asked him to come up for a movie night, he refused with a strained, rattling cough that sounded too harsh for someone his age. The other thing was the language. Dale majored in minimum effort, not linguistics. But he started mumbling when he slept now, audible through the cheap HVAC vent that shared the main floor bedroom to his cellar space. It began with unintelligible whispers, usually a soft clicking or scraping noise, then slowly transitioned into recognizable cadence, but not recognizable words. It sounded like an awful, guttural form of Latin, maybe, a series of hard G's and rolling R's separated by sharp, barking expirations. When our mom finally heard it one Tuesday morning, loud enough from her spot at the kitchen table, she just nervously called it stressful puberty and loud music causing auditory confusion, which was the family's main way of handling a crisis. Dad, a retired Marine who only communicated in commands, just told Dale to take some aspirin and to stop bothering his mother. And Dale listened, but only in the most terrifying way. Dale finally stopped talking. His appearances became unsettling. When he came up for those required Sunday dinners, he had no presence. He walked right past us without acknowledging anyone, stood at the kitchen counter staring at the wood grain for 10 minutes, then helped himself to an alarming amount of red meat and bread, and took it back down to his bunker, slamming the low basement door with an authority he surely hadn't owned 3 months prior. His hands were shaking all the time, a rapid, low-amplitude tremor that he didn't even notice. And when he spoke back to my dad, an event which had rarely failed to create a 10-hour shouting match with heavy sanctions, he didn't sound like Dale. Dad once asked him to change his oil for the old Ford sedan, a standard chore. Dale responded with a low, smooth voice, completely devoid of teenage irritation and angst, saying in an echoingly placid tone, "We are considering your imposition upon our schedule." My dad just stopped slicing the chicken and stared into the air, as still and white as the snow outside. He never asked Dale to do a chore again. But it got worse. The things coming from the basement tenant, as I started to subconsciously call it, began to mimic my father. My father had a distinct, deep, basso-speaking style, a way of enunciating that projected authority and a residual military toughness. My dad, in his mid-50s at the time, also suffered from a lifelong smoking habit that made his true voice slightly more ragged when he was tired. One night, around 2 in the morning, which was my prime slot for video games, I swore I heard my dad moving around downstairs, walking his specific, heavy gait on the wood floor. He was speaking, too, talking about the furnace suddenly breaking. I was already too tired for this. I grabbed an old blanket and padded to the top of the stairs, ready to tell him I'd look at the furnace in the morning. When I reached the small, dark landing, bathed only in the distant street light glow through the window, I heard the voice clearly coming from the bottom of the basement stairs right below me. It was Dad's voice, too clear, a perfect copy of his tone and bass. The only thing wrong was one crucial detail. It was my dad's voice before the smoking had taken hold. It was the smooth, strong, unwavering command of a 40-year-old Marine captain, but talking with a dry, cracked, unnatural repetition. "We need to acquire the heat for her lord." Pause. Heat. Lord. Below. I froze instantly. My real father was easily audible snoring, loudly but rhythmically, from the master bedroom directly down the hall. I stood absolutely still, my knuckles white on the flimsy wooden banister. The low, imitation father voice repeated the sentence again, this time adding a bizarre, wet chirping sound at the end, as if the imitation was straining at the boundary of what could be imitated. It went quiet. Then came the sound that solidified everything inside my 18-year-old brain, the rattling, metallic sound of the shallow basement door opening, slowly, creak by agonizing creak. Whatever was down there, whatever had been talking to itself, learning to speak in broken Latin, and then adapting the tone of my Marine father, was now coming up, leaving the confines of the basement tenant for the quiet, dark space of the main house. I stumbled back, not running, but crawling backward along the carpet, desperately trying not to make a noise that would indicate my presence at the top of the stairs. As I reached the doorway to my room, I saw it. The hallway was empty. The sound of the lock and bolt on my door was louder than everything else, louder than the rain and the silence of the rest of the house. I sat against the door, holding my breath, staring at the weak light filtering in from the window. Minutes bled away. I heard a noise that sounded like a very fine, dry scratching, an insect perhaps, which quickly grew into a sound more unsettling than the walking I had avoided. It was quiet, repetitive, metallic tapping. Ping, ping, ping. Then, the sound was right outside my door, in the hall. It sounded like fingernails tapping, not on the wood, but on the metal strike plate of the doorframe itself. And then the voice began again. My dad's pre-smoking voice. Only this time, it was distorted, slowed down. Syllables stretched into echoing horror and punctuated by heavy, wet swapping sounds of breath. Swapping sound. Are you hiding, son? Swapping sound. Your brother has been a good tenant. Swapping sound. The terrifying thing was the attempt at empathy or parental concern, a grotesque effort to convince me. The wet swapping, the sound of thick mucus or something even worse moving inside the vocal cords, confirmed my suspicions about the entity's unhuman nature. I stayed silent, frozen in the corner of my room, completely still until the sun broke the horizon, ignoring the cold sweat that I was drenched in. When the early autumn sun finally peeked through the window pane, bringing with it a sliver of normalcy and light, the tapping stopped. The shuffling, wet sounds in the hallway stopped. When I finally found the courage to open the door, hours later, the hall was completely empty, silent, and smelling faintly of ozone and something like crushed mothballs. I looked down the small stairwell to the basement. Dale's door was shut, securely bolted. I listened. Nothing. Just an ordinary, quiet house on a Tuesday morning. I went to the kitchen. My real father was at the table, loudly coughing, reading the finance section of the newspaper, a huge thermos of black coffee sitting next to him. Dad never once mentioned the voice I had heard. Dale finally emerged for breakfast, hours later. He looked just as malnourished as he had the other times. As he reached past me for the toaster, a sudden movement made me look down. His right forearm. Just below the short sleeve of his shirt, there was a raised mark on the skin that looked strangely like dried ink or a brand. I didn't know what I was looking at. Maybe a small burn. But the image was clear enough to send a knife-sharp chill down my spine. The mark was a perfect circle, about the size of a quarter. Embedded in its center, a swirling, complex set of lines, barely visible, but strikingly precise. I reached out instinctively to rub the skin. He flinched away from my touch. His eyes, once soft brown, were now pitch black and intense. His pupils were not small. They were unnaturally large, like black holes swallowing his original color entirely. Then, his face did something worse than stare blankly at me, a rapid, grotesque mimicry of a friendly smile, a series of complex muscles flexing and rippling, ending in a perfectly straight, uncanny line. I froze in place. Years later, Dale had fully recovered. He was healthy, finished college, and took a job at an IT firm in Silicon Valley. He never mentioned the basement tenant to me, but I didn't need him to. The truth wasn't in his words, but in the silence. Because every time my real father had a severe coughing fit, the kind that racked his body, Dale would stop what he was doing, wherever he was, and look directly at me with that unnatural, black-eyed intensity, a silent challenge in the void of his pupils. I finally understood it all. The possession hadn't been thrown out, it had only been temporarily housed, borrowing the voice, learning the man, and waiting for its moment to claim him in full. The basement tenant wasn't a temporary resident. He had paid us a long, terrible visit, and I knew for certain that sooner or later, as the decades passed, that imitation of my father's voice would become perfect, and I would be left wondering who was sitting at the breakfast table. Story 5. I've always loved the woods of Yosemite. The smell of lodgepole pine, the high granite peaks, the sheer, unapologetic scale of it all. It's a cathedral of nature. A few years back, I'd gone out with two college friends, Jeremy and Mike, on a fairly aggressive 5-day hike deep into the backcountry, far north of the main trails everyone takes. We weren't wilderness experts, but we were competent, well-supplied, and had a decent map. We were aiming for an obscure, alpine lake known only to the diehard types. Things went wrong on the second day, but not in the way you'd imagine. Not a bear, not a twisted ankle, or a rapid change in weather. It was a failure of the world's physics, a momentary but sustained slip out of the natural order that left an existential burn scar on my sense of reality. The issue was, quite simply, space. We got lost around midday after a slightly aggressive scramble over a set of granite boulders near an unnamed creek. Jeremy, who had the map and the most reliable sense of direction, insisted we were due north of the boulder field and needed to head east for 30 degrees to intersect the marked trail. I thought we were more to the southeast. Mike, unsurprisingly, was no help and just wanted to take a 5-minute break. A normal navigational dispute in the wilderness is quickly resolved by compass or sun position, but once we restarted and walked for another strenuous 15 minutes, moving over a shallow slope, we broke out into what should have been a thick pine forest, but instead, was a nearly perfect, 300-foot diameter grassy meadow. And the instant Mike broke the tree line, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Wait!" he said, holding up a cautious hand. "Didn't we just come from there?" We looked around. The meadow was bordered by thick, nearly identical-looking forest on three sides, with the creek, the same unnamed one, I was certain, snaking rapidly away on the fourth. In the center of the clearing sat a single, massive boulder, split cleanly in half with a dark, vertical fault line running through it. Jeremy immediately grew agitated. He recognized the meadow, too, and definitely recognized the signature split boulder. We'd eaten lunch 2 hours prior, sitting in the shadow of that exact crevice, resting 30 minutes after our morning hike uphill. We hadn't been in a straight line, but we certainly hadn't circled back, either, having climbed steadily over the ridge we were disputing the coordinates of. There was no point of reference to confirm it was the same meadow aside from our memory, but the split rock felt too particular, too unique to ignore. We checked the compass. It pointed decidedly north, and the shadows dictated late afternoon, consistent with hours of sustained hiking. The physics was wrong. The geography was an absolute lie. We had, and possibly, walked in a vast, wide circle, uphill, over dense terrain, and wound up right back where we had lunched. We were deeply unsettled, but the sun was fading, meaning we had to move past it. We chose a clear vector, noted which side of the rock we started from, and started marching, determined not to stop until we had covered serious ground. We marched for a full hour and a half, not fast, but persistent and consistent across the uneven forest floor. We were tired, slightly unnerved, but we kept pushing through the dense, repetitive mountain woods. And then, we broke out into another clearing. Same size. Same rapid creek. My heart actually sank in my chest. The same split boulder. We had walked in a straight line for 90 minutes, and were back at the starting point. When it happened the third time, 2 hours later, we didn't wait for morning. We didn't even argue. We just swore, dropped our packs, and realized we were caught. The realization wasn't just that we were lost. It was the comprehension that this part of the world, this vast, beautiful, well-mapped national park, was cheating us. Someone, or something, was pulling at the very map of reality just for this quadrant of the forest. We were in an illogical, physically contradictory time loop of space. Darkness had fallen, a dense, consuming mountain darkness that even the stars couldn't pierce. We were all three huddled up inside our expensive, 0-degree rated sleeping bags, trying to mentally calculate how much food we had left. A wave of profound despair washed over us, the kind you only get when you accept that your reliance on logic has become irrelevant. The rain started just as Jeremy was whispering about the need for immediate, professional rescue, a thin, miserable drizzle that wasn't even strong enough to drown out the night noises. The forest around us was loud. Not with animals, but with the sound of snapping twigs, quiet brush passing against material, and unmistakably and horribly, a faint, guttural, dragging sound slightly less heavy than the noise I'd heard inside the New England house. My anxiety spiked. I reached out for my phone. Hopeless, still no signal after 3 days. But then I remembered I had managed to pick up one full bar of low-range FM radio signal on a classic handheld model I used for weather and time alerts. I pulled it out, flicked the power on, and hit the scan button. Static rushed in, and then unexpectedly, a low voice, male, somewhat familiar, immediately cut through the white noise. It was a slow, slightly elongated drawl, the kind a person uses when they are speaking to themselves or trying to get the pronunciation of common words exactly correct. And it was speaking my name repeatedly. Will, listen to yourself. Will. My terror was instantly replaced by a deep and heavy adrenaline-soaked confusion. With frantic fingers, I cranked the volume dial. The voice intensified, moving from the speaker in a strained, painful-sounding rush. The voice wasn't narrating my story or telling me what to do. It was giving an account of a hike, of 3 people losing their minds over a repeating meadow. It was me. It was my voice, recounting my fear, detailing the lack of orientation, complaining about Jeremy's bad navigation, talking about the split boulder. The vocal projection was slightly more rushed than my natural speaking pattern, riddled with a kind of hysterical anxiety and a low background groaning noise. But the specific cadence, the phrasing, and the pitch, it was an exact, undeniable facsimile of my own terrified internal monologue being broadcast over an empty FM frequency. I started shaking my head, a desperate attempt to dislodge the sound from my reality. This was a sophisticated prank, perhaps a hidden low-power transmitter Jeremy or Mike had brought. I searched for a way to stop it, to turn it off, staring wild-eyed into the pitch black of the tent. "The clock is wrong, Will. Will," the radio version of my own voice said. "You should never have taken the radio on the 5th day." The 5th day. My blood turned to ice. Today was only the 2nd day. Had I, the version of me in the box, already lived past today? I had only a moment to think of the temporal horror of what I was holding. Then the recording ended. Abruptly. Not with a cutout, not with white noise, but with a sharp, deep sound of a thick, clamping noise, like a jaw snapping shut, a wet, final tchak, of something large closing on something small. Then silence. Only the sound of the rain, the sound of the quiet breathing of anxiety next to me. Jeremy had been asleep. Mike was awake, crying silently into his shoulder, face hidden from me. He said he hadn't heard anything except the final tchak sound over the radio. But he said that noise was enough. We left early in the drizzle of the morning, not even bothering to pack. We just put on our hiking boots, grabbed the packs they were in, and walked a desperate, single vector. The logical way out. We passed the same meadow, the same split boulder, for the 4th time that morning within 2 hours of walking. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. We ignored the profound irony and just pushed, refusing to look left or right, driven solely by the irrational, non-navigational terror instilled by the radio. We made it out by the 7th hour, exhausted, scratched, and mentally shattered, but functional. We stopped at the first small, roadside diner we saw, drinking 7 coffees each, talking over each other's words to keep the terror at bay. I tried to explain the audio. The terror of hearing my own voice narrate a moment that hadn't happened yet. They didn't know what to believe. To this day, I can't shake the image of 4 days of my life being lived out elsewhere, recorded, and broadcast back to me, only to end with an unavoidable, fatal clamping sound. I never finished that memory. I don't know what happened to future me in the tent in 5 days in the woods. But every time I touch a radio dial, I feel the same clammy, immediate panic, a chilling reminder that, somewhere out there in the high country of the Yosemite Peaks, the version of me stuck on a 2-day-long spatial loop only had 4 days remaining, and that I was somehow warned of his fate by his own terrified voice, leaving me in a different, but infinitely more terrifying prison of unknown, permanent safety. Story 6. It's always the coastal fog that brings out the worst things. I used to laugh about it when I first volunteered there, telling the other guys that living and working on the Oregon coast should be sponsored by Stephen King. Our base was an old, defunct Coast Guard station in Tillamook County. It wasn't picturesque. It was just another bleak piece of concrete and wood infrastructure that state contractors didn't get around to raising. We weren't a government agency. We were the Coastal Paranormal Investigation (CPI) team, comprised of 6 serious individuals led by a stern but brilliant former history professor named Dr. Shaw. Most of what we did was quiet, EMF detection, analyzing EVP recordings, and generally being very patient while we got absolutely nothing. But the old lighthouse on the northernmost cliff in Tillamook was what had drawn Dr. Shaw out of academic retirement. We called it the Lighthouse Keeper's Vow. We couldn't get the official paperwork to enter the lighthouse itself, a stunning 1880s cast iron structure, so our focus was the surrounding area, the abandoned stone residences, the boathouse, and the fog bell keeper's house near the cliff's edge. The goal was to prove, once and for all, the legendary story that the last keeper, consumed by isolation and the deep blue void of the Pacific, had taken his own life inside the light source, cursing the tower to never be lit again. The environment alone was enough to make any sane person turn around. Even on a completely sunny afternoon, the air felt cold, intensely pressurized, and utterly silent near the lighthouse. It was a sensory desert that amplified nothing but our anxiety and the screech of gulls. We set our gear up in the Fog Bell Station, an old wooden structure that afforded a direct, terrifying view of the steep, wind-battered coast. The first few weeks were boring. We recorded high baseline EMFs due to old wiring and sheer volume of metal, and our thermal cameras showed nothing beyond the heat signatures of our own bodies and the resident squirrel population. Patience was paramount. Our fourth week, however, yielded results. A pattern began to emerge, not on the equipment, but in our psychology. We were always tired, no matter how much we slept. We were always thirsty, yet drinking water did nothing to alleviate the dry mouth sensation. And every day, for at least 2 hours in the late afternoon, every one of us suffered from distinct, throbbing oral pain on the side of our heads, as if someone was gently twisting a small, blunted ice pick behind our eardrums. We never discussed it. We just treated it as an unwelcome side effect of high-altitude anxiety and the constant, crashing sound of the Pacific below. When the real data started coming only late during the final night of our fourth week, I was on a lone monitor loop, watching the black and white feed from a camera pointed into the boathouse. The rain outside was relentless and furious, combining with a brutal onshore gale that shook the structure we camped in, making the whole expedition feel immediately more terrifying in nature. Suddenly, on the screen, a distinct, organized mass of darkness swept rapidly from the far corner of the boathouse. Not a shadow, not a smudge on the lens, but a three-dimensional shape that distorted the light, moving aggressively towards the central wooden beam. Dr. Shaw rushed from his corner, immediately focusing on the feed. The shape reached the beam, and then, the boathouse camera went instantly white, overexposed to a brilliant, impossible light that completely bleached the screen. Then it went entirely dark. The power supply had failed. But before the failure, we got something undeniable. Shaw rewound the digital video card. For 3 distinct moments, there was an audible, low, ragged human grunt coming out of the speakers, directly linked to the black form rushing into the beam. Most chillingly, the shadow mass was leaving faint, vapor trails behind it, like superambient heat. We were sitting on a breakthrough. We pulled our full-spectrum flashlights and headlamps, geared up quickly, and pushed out, running headfirst into the brutal storm and the swirling, intense fog rolling off the sea. Our entire goal was now to find out what had happened to the light. We ran directly for the lighthouse, the actual building. The 200 yards separating us had never felt so intensely hostile. Now, as our equipment tracked high, chaotic EMF readings surging towards the tower, the air grew incredibly still. The brutal wind stopped. The intense rain instantly diminished to a light, freezing coastal mist, and the only sound now was the water running off the edges of the high cliffs below us, adding a terrifying sense of artificial silence to the world. We stopped at the base of the tower, scanning the ground with our wide-beam flashlights. Then, something concrete appeared. Directly on the storm-washed, wet stone, an arrangement of small, brittle, and impossibly dry sand dollars were perfectly placed right in the path to the heavy, secured iron door of the lighthouse, 17 of them. It was a warning, a line you crossed. As our flashlights swept over the ancient, rust-streaked iron door, we made out, etched into the heavily pitted paint, the clear, legible outline of a roughly drawn human hand, marked in something that wasn't red paint and wasn't rust, but dried and flaking deep brown, presumably blood. This vow the old keeper had cursed was, somehow, still actively being protected. We needed more data. I pulled the team EMF reader and pushed my hand under the heavy iron seal of the door. The sensor suddenly screamed, a raw, continuous high-pitched shriek of impossible electromagnetic energy that peaked out the machine. Something was in there, pressing against the door. Whatever had drained the batteries in the boathouse camera was now confined inside, radiating sheer, uncontained hostility. It was a discovery too precious to simply back away from. Shaw, ever the academic adrenaline junkie, had one tool left, a wideband audio recorder that he always joked was the Ghost Voice Finder 5000. He wedged the microphone tightly into a minute crack in the massive iron hinge of the door facing the rough sea. What came out was a deep, sustained, echoing moan, utterly amplified by the iron and granite shell of the tower. It was the sound of profound, unrelenting, thousand-yard sorrow, not from a living person, but from a broken engine block weeping air and pure psychic despair. It rose in pitch from a low, drawn-out vowel cry to a screaming, white-hot whine that made every inch of my body feel as though my blood had been replaced with compressed, pressurized air. Then over our frozen, absolute terror, came the man's voice. Strong, clear, a deep, professional baritone, but cracking with insane pride and the relentless, deep certainty of a man who believed in his purpose beyond all reality. It wasn't a whisper. It was an echoing, sustained lecture of pure, focused, possessive rage pouring directly into the audio cable. You think a light means hope that you can walk away from this coast? You think fire cleanses? The voice bellowed, thick with salt and the cold air of the past century. I took the sun from its hands from this light. I took the heat from the lamp's heart. The coast needed me here. It asked for the permanent silence. Do not return the sun. Do not. Only I dash. The sound cut off again. A rapid, frantic ripping noise, like heavy sheet metal being rent right near the end of the cable line where the microphone was sealed in the gap. The EMF device, which had been peaking since it broke through the door in the first place, finally melted, producing a pathetic puff of smoke from the battery compartment. Shaw pulled his remaining cable end from the ruined device in the wall. The 2 inches that remained of the microphone were crushed, not folded, but compressed into a flattened, paper-thin, unidentifiable metallic scrap. We scattered after that. Not a hurried, confused panic, but a slow, calculated, cold retreat back along the wind-chilled path. We abandoned the equipment. The keeper had warned us using everything he had, physical shapes out of light and shadow, the cold, psychic drain, the perfectly placed sign of dried currency, and finally, his screaming, possessive voice. The fear was simple. His vow was an act of a physical will that had surpassed death, one that would permanently protect the darkness of this small part of the coast. We packed up our base in absolute silence, and radioed out the next morning that the equipment was corrupted and the ambient readings were too chaotic to draw conclusions from, a blatant professional lie. We left the entire coast by the afternoon. The small town was just another piece of peaceful Oregon to the rest of the world, unaware they were living alongside a truly haunted space, protected by the vengeful spirit of the final keeper who took the one thing the town needed most, the light. Story 7. I live in what I'd call a suburban whisper. It's the kind of Texas neighborhood built over former farmland, all manicured lawns, identical 2-story beige houses, and quiet, deeply private lives. I moved there after a nasty divorce specifically for the anonymity. I just wanted to be a background character, working my remote tech job, watching the sky, and ignoring the world. And it worked. Until the first rainy Tuesdays in October of last year started rolling around, covering everything in a cool, miserable film of water, pulling the air low, and forcing the neighbors indoors. That's when my chosen sanctuary, my quiet suburb, turned personal and targeted. And it did so through sound. It started like a misheard noise, the kind of indistinct sound that wakes you up at 3 in the morning just to confuse you further. I was asleep, listening to a high, persistent wind mixed with the driving rain, and I woke up cold, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't understand why, until I heard it, a soft, drawn-out pist. It didn't sound like my house, not inside. It sounded like it was coming from the side lawn, near my neighbor Ted's tool shed. Since a manicured lawn meant no significant privacy barrier, that sound had just effortlessly crossed the 20 feet of separation between our properties and penetrated my deep sleep. It was just a quiet hiss, I rationalized, probably the wind fighting through the decorative lattice fence. I rolled over, trying to ignore the chill in the pit of my stomach. Seconds later, it shifted from a hiss to a low, sustained whisper. And this time, it was clear that it was intended to be language. It was calling my name, repeated as though pulled taut over a painful surface. Matt, pause. Masaya. And the sound was not coming from Ted's shed. It had moved. Now, it was directly in front of my bedroom window, pressed right up against the security blinds. I shot up in bed, absolutely drenched by a sudden flow of cold panic. I was alone in the house. The internal alarm system was unarmed since I detested its low electrical hum. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? For a whisper? The rain outside suddenly intensified, a massive wave of water washing down the window. The sound disappeared under the roar of the deluge. I sat up for 20 minutes, my ears strained against the background noise, listening for another human sound. Nothing. Must have been drunk college kids playing a terrible juvenile prank on the new guy. That was my forced conclusion. The explanation satisfied only the intellectual part of my brain. The emotional center was a shivering, hyper-alert wreck. The second time, it was a week later. Another Tuesday night, another Texas rainstorm, and the air was again thick and cold. I was awake, reading on the sofa in the living room, trying to find an electrical hum loud enough to drown out my anxiety from the previous week. Around 1:45 a.m., I heard a deep, profound voice, not a whisper, not a hiss, but a low, guttural drone. It was too far away to distinguish words, starting, I judged, from about 2 houses down the block, and it was moving. It sounded physically labored, like someone dragging a 60-pound sack of sand across wet gravel. The sound became slightly more discernible as it came closer, passing Ted's house. I flicked off the floor lamp by rapid impulse and stood pressed against the cold wall near the window, straining my ears, my hands slick with sweat. The volume increased steadily, not like an increase in energy, but rather a slow, terrifying, physical approach down the suburban asphalt street. And then, the words came clear, and they destroyed my composure entirely. The voice was that of a man, familiar but wrong, delivering a sequence of phrases that were so perfectly me that I shook with disbelief. The voice recited my first elementary school address, long since demolished farmland, then my private college application essay theme, a deeply personal theme about my grandmother, and finally, my ex-wife's middle name, and where we got engaged. Then, and this was the worst part, it repeated, over and over, stretched into a terrible, strained vowel sound, a full sentence that was my most deeply held. Silent truth. You think you're hidden, Matthew. There is no hidden here. We see the Matthew. It trailed off on a wet, rasping inhale that was identical to the breathing sound of the entity from my brother's basement. It stopped right on the curb in front of my house. I could feel the invisible heat and the pressure of its gaze through the dry wall. The thing was silent now, as patient as a predator hiding in plain sight. I didn't dare move to the window. I remained against the wall, shotgun in hand, my fingers numb against the cold steel receiver. All I could think of was the thing's movement. It was laboring, slow, almost like it was moving through something akin to thick syrup or extremely deep mud. It was trying to escape some force, only to use that labored arrival to announce my immediate, total compromise. It stayed in my front yard for maybe an hour, a solid column of focused anxiety in the dark. I waited, shotgun pointed at the ceiling, breath held like a child trying to hide from a monster. Finally, just before sunrise, the kind of pale gray, weak light that breaks tension with sheer familiarity, the sound of scraping, dragging, labored movement recommenced. It started moving away, back down the asphalt street, towards the house where it had originally emerged, quickly receding out of earshot. As the last, fading sound left my perception and the familiar sound of a neighbor's morning newspaper delivery truck replaced the paranoia-inducing silence, I felt the tension snap, releasing me back into the world. My life in the suburbs was a lie. The whole community and its quiet, low-lit nature was not a sanctuary. It was a cage designed for observation. A quiet, terrifying place where everything was orderly and easily searchable. I spent the next week, not getting over it, but preparing for it. I bought expensive security monitoring for the main electrical systems, rigged 3 new cameras, and armed the complex alarm system on the second story of my small haven. The third whisper night came right on schedule, exactly 1 week later, the same Tuesday, the same terrible rain. But this time I was ready. I didn't have to wait long. At 1:50 a.m., I was in the security room on the second floor when the alarm system, armed on the main floor, suddenly switched from secure green to a flashing, immediate red interruption, with the audible recording that a magnetic seal on the front bay window had been broken. It was here! But the audio in the room, a directional microphone I had bought for recording the local bird calls, didn't pick up a crash, or a gunshot, or even the sound of an intruder trying to pry the window pane. It picked up a single, sharp sigh. An audible, strained, pained exhale of effort. Then the voice, my exact voice, clear as a bell, speaking with deep disappointment. "You armed the window, Matthew. Why? You were never guarded before." The voice was now inside my sealed, controlled, two-story house. There was no laborious dragging, no whispering needed. It had simply bypassed both the wall and the window alarm completely, not with force, but with knowledge and the strange implication of betrayal. I didn't wait. I turned the camera system on, 3 perfect, crisp color feeds running simultaneously, and hit my main power switch, plunging the entire house, including the central air and the small monitor I was watching, into instant, physical darkness. I sat in a perfect, cold void, hoping the lack of internal light would somehow make me invisible to whatever energy creature was standing only 1 flight of stairs below me. The rain outside continued its heavy, rhythmic drumming, washing the whole suburban world in its white noise rhythm. I don't know how long I sat there, but my watch finally showed 4:30 a.m. when the tension in the room, the strange feeling of oppressive density, started to retreat, slowly receding back down to the ground floor. Then I heard a terrible sound that I still interpret as a goodbye, a quick, physical scrape across the linoleum tile of the kitchen floor, followed by nothing but the sound of the rain. I moved out shortly after, selling the suburban sanctuary to a young couple who couldn't have moved in fast enough. I still live on my own now, but I made a hard rule. I will never live anywhere without a basement beneath me and 3 tall stories above that. Because I realized the suburban whisper wasn't just my name being called out in the night. It was the simple, horrifying truth about the ease of finding a target in a place built for total visual and intellectual convenience. There are no secrets in the suburbs, only quiet, perfect places to hide, sit, stalk, and finally feed. And now, every time the weather changes, I look out at all those identical houses and I wonder which anonymous neighbor will pay the same terrible toll I did. Story 8. It's often said you save money working the graveyard shift, that they pay you extra for the unpleasantness of existing entirely out of phase with the sun. I'm here to tell you that's a lie. They pay you extra because of the ghosts, especially when you work in a building that was, for a full century of history, a funeral home. I'd taken the gig out of college, easy money, no people contact, required just a walk-and-lock schedule. The building was in New Orleans, Louisiana, one of the older, brick-sided structures a few streets away from the main commercial district, once the very prestigious, family-run Valois funeral parlor. By the time I took the late-night security job, it was halfway through a massive renovation, being converted into high-end executive office space. 2 entire floors of the building were either ripped up to the ancient hardwood or gutted down to the studs. My job was simple: walk through at 11:30 p.m., another at 2 a.m., and a final one at 4 a.m., making sure no contractors or squatters were using the empty space. But mainly, my job was to withstand the palpable sense of dread and history the building still radiated. I can't tell you the total number of wakes, embalming sessions, and final goodbyes that had occurred in that space, but the place felt like all of that history had been physically compressed and smeared across the walls. The first few weeks were boring. Lights would flicker in the construction zone, things I'd left on a table a few days prior might be moved to another workbench, but a dozen contractors worked those floors during the day, so I shrugged it off as general incompetence. Then came the midnight tension, something that always settled itself over the building at 12:05 a.m. It wasn't a sound, it was an absence. The hum of the construction lights and the distant sound of an emergency generator in the courtyard would simply cut out abruptly, followed by an immediate, deep silence that was physical and profound. The building then proceeded to breathe in the dark, a slow, creaking, rhythmic sound you'd only hear if you were in the very center of the lower, untouched service floor, the place where the viewing chapel had once been. My favorite place to avoid was the loading bay and the maintenance area attached to it. The area had been left untouched by all renovations, a small, dark back room with a massive industrial elevator at one end and a single, heavy steel double door set in the middle of a brick archway. This was the door where every single corpse and every single casket over that century had been first brought into the Valois funeral parlor, and where they had finally been removed. The door radiated a negative, heavy energy, one that seemed to physically drain the flashlight battery with incredible speed. I knew, with the horrible certainty of someone trapped in a confined space, that the midnight tension ended at that door. Whatever energy the place held, the terror coalesced right there, sitting between the steel doors, waiting for me to walk by it. On my 2 a.m. walkthrough, 2 weeks in, I had a terrifying experience, my first. As I descended from the unfinished third floor, the silence completely enveloping, no breathing today, I reached the second-story landing and realized the contractor's large, heavy-duty ladder I had left there had been moved. It wasn't just tilted. It had been meticulously dragged across the concrete floor and was now leaning at a slight, unnatural angle against the exposed brick wall, exactly 90 degrees from where I had left it. It was too heavy for a stray wind, and far too intentional for a contractor's mistake. I moved it back, a huge physical effort. My nerves were frayed, but I convinced myself it was a contractor's sick way of saying, "Hello, we know you're here." I continued my inspection. On the ground floor, the darkest and most intact floor, the former home of the grand, high-ceilinged wake rooms, I reached the steel door again. I always checked it last. My flashlight immediately picked up a glistening trail on the polished, dark red travertine floor. It was a liquid trail, clear, thick, and viscous, running exactly 1 foot out from the massive crack where the steel doors met the ancient marble floor. Where I had sworn the tension always settled. The trail looked like condensation, but with a terrible density, and it smelled distinctly of stale ozone and something like very old flower petals mixed with deep-fried pork fat. It was physically offensive. Suddenly, I heard the sound that confirmed I didn't want to be there anymore, a sharp snapping noise from the main wiring conduit about 5 feet directly above the double door. The snapping was followed by a complete loss of power in my flashlight, from a strong beam to total blackness in an instant. I immediately thought of the house where shadows feed. This place was feeding, too. But on what? Left in absolute darkness, the oppressive silence and the intense smell from the door were all I could perceive inside that ancient funeral home. The adrenaline rushed so hard I heard it thrumming in my ears. I scrambled one-handed out of the room, fumbling my feet over dropped construction debris and racing towards the main, exterior glass doors near the street where a hint of light existed. I slammed the emergency bar and tore one set of doors open, collapsing outside into the welcome blast of the cool, drizzling night air, landing hard on the slick concrete just outside the perimeter. What had been a complete silence inside for the last 15 minutes was immediately broken by a sound that made me instantly terrified all over again, an agonizing, continuous metallic shriek that sounded exactly like the main internal industrial elevator, the kind used only for caskets and large equipment, was rapidly cycling up and down, hitting the ceiling and floor with terrifying, continuous, grinding thuds. But an elevator cycling wildly on its own was impossible. The system had been disconnected and padlocked for months as the crew renovated the top floor. Now, it shrieked like a dying, frantic animal trying to claw its way out of the building. I didn't wait to see if the shriek intensified. I simply ran down the outside alley toward the street-facing temporary security post that held my car keys and my radio. I finally managed to call the supervisor outside, but I was so breathless and incoherent on the temporary radio crackle that he eventually told me, politely, to simply gather my nerves, stop listening to the rain, and restart my walkthrough slowly. He hung up. I was alone again. I grabbed my spare flashlight and with deep, crippling reluctance, I re-entered the ancient building by the main entrance. The metallic shriek of the phantom elevator was gone. Utter silence had returned, followed quickly by the heavy breathing of the building commencing again, a slow, creaking, awful exhale of old air that moved the dust on the floor subtly. I grabbed a small, dense titanium tool from a nearby construction station, a sort of pathetic weapon, but a weapon nonetheless, and went for the final walkthrough. I only needed to check the basement one last time, where some old boiler equipment was still stored. The basement, an actual deep basement, unlike my brother's, was pitch black, not from the outage, but from its pure natural darkness. The only light was the weak beam from my spare flashlight. I walked the long row of dusty boiler equipment, casting huge, chaotic shadows around the cement room, trying to find any visual artifact to explain what had happened to the elevator. I found nothing. Right as I was giving up, ready to turn around and race for the final 4 a.m. checkout, I stepped into a particularly bad patch of soft, waterlogged dirt at the back of the machinery. And as my foot sank slightly, I heard a quiet, almost imperceptible sound, singing. It was a single, gentle, beautiful tenor voice. Just a simple hymn, the kind of beautiful song they teach in old Catholic school choirs for the dearly departed. It was so out of place that it was immediately terrifying, a small, tiny piece of fragile, beautiful humanity hidden inside the industrial dark. The voice was singing to me, about me being tired and resting. My flashlight trembled as I held it high, shaking off my shoulder, trying to find the source. And the light found it. In the lowest, darkest part of the room, perched precariously and impossibly high on a shelf far above the last boiler, was an object, a huge, antique, brown paper, cardboard storage box, the size contractors used for packing drywall, the same package design they used to move the embalming supplies back in the 1960s. And the singing was now clearly coming from inside the box. The box sat on the highest shelf. No person, not even someone who had brought a huge ladder like the one that was moved upstairs, could have put that huge, 50-pound paper box on that rusted shelf without significant effort. It didn't belong. It was impossibly high. And finally, my eyes focused on the front label, yellowed with age, but still perfectly crisp and legible. It contained 5 words written in clear, thick black marker, a final piece of terror planted right on the edge of the light beam. Vol.1 Funeral Home. Final viewings. Keep closed. My terror was now pure, physical paralysis. The voice inside the box sang its final, high-pitched, gentle note. Then, a single low, rasping sound, like someone taking a long, tearing cloth and slowly dragging it across a dry marble surface, emanated from inside the box itself, immediately followed by the distinct sound of breathing, the same, heavy, familiar, slow exhalation that the entire building made when it was in its resting phase. The source of the building's supernatural life had found me. I dropped the massive titanium tool and ran. I didn't return. I didn't call to explain. I never saw the morning light inside that terrible building again, and I didn't care what the supervisor said. I'll keep taking the easy night money job at the anonymous shipping warehouse. Because I know this, it was never about the living being able to look in at the work of the dead. It was about the final viewings contained inside that box finally escaping the basement and getting comfortable in a familiar lobby. The ancient funeral home didn't have ghosts on the ceiling. It contained a living soul, locked in the basement, singing hymns, and waiting for the right kind of darkness and silence to begin its service again. Story 9. My new house in suburban Dallas, Texas, was quiet. Too quiet, until the heavy winter rains settled in, and then the quiet transitioned to something more complicated, a soft, pervasive low hum. And the hum soon became associated with something much worse, the sound of what may or may not have been my own name, a recurring terror from a small, low-lit section of suburban curb. But before all that, our relationship as neighbors was peaceful. I lived in a corner house, 2 decades older than the developments surrounding it, meaning I had some big, old oaks in the backyard that gave me a real sense of separation. My nearest neighbor was across the cul-de-sac, an elderly gentleman who had been a local accountant named Eugene, a silent and harmless observer of the shifting suburbs. Every night, his quiet living room light would turn off exactly at 11:30 p.m., a physical signal that the nightly watch had ended, and the time for sleep had begun. Mine, too, not just his. On the last Tuesday in February, about a month after I had moved in, all the bad things happened on Tuesday, it seems. A cold and heavy rain was falling hard enough to muffle the sounds of traffic from the highway half a mile away. It was 11:45 p.m., a full 15 minutes past Eugene's mandated blackout. I was settling into bed when I heard it for the first time. It started outside my closed window, right on the edge of the glass, a soft, protracted whisper. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone trying to get the attention of a single person in a large crowd. "My name, Matthew," whispered with a strangely truncated end, almost a sigh. I froze. I didn't move. My bedroom was on the second floor. Nobody was on the lawn outside. It was impossible, except the cold, creeping sensation of being physically examined was absolute and complete behind the window right next to my head. My first thought was the worst kind of paranoia, that after my terrible experience in the Sububian Whisper, the entity had followed me here. I immediately bolted up in bed, looking through the thin, useless screen of the window for any sort of shape or movement out in the black air. The rain was persistent and heavy, creating a waterfall effect on the pane, obscuring the view. And there, down near the curb of my house, bathed in the diffuse glow of a sodium street lamp filtering through the mist, I saw what appeared to be a dark shape. It was a man. Too still, too close to Eugene's curb. He was standing completely motionless, staring directly at my window with a kind of persistent, frightening patience that belied the cold and wet weather. This wasn't some college kid, this was an adult. The darkness obscured any specifics. No face, only the looming suggestion of a black, heavy coat collar pulled over a head. But I saw the movement of the shoulders. The man shifted his weight and then pointed a heavy, dark index finger directly at the glass of my window before slowly turning away and blending instantly back into the heavy, black air of the cul-de-sac. I sat there, frozen, for a long 20 minutes. I was tired of thinking. I was tired of being the target. At 12:40 a.m., I called the non-emergency dispatch, reporting a suspicious loiterer who was clearly wearing dark attire with intent to burgle. The police didn't come. I finally gave up and settled into my uneasy sleep. The second night it happened, it was 2 weeks later. Monday instead of Tuesday. But the rain was back, heavier and colder than before, settling up against the house like a cold, wet animal. This time, I was awake and ready. I had poured a drink, turned on every light in the main floor, and sat in my office chair by the window, watching the street. At 1:30 a.m., I heard the noise again. The loud drone. Laboring. Dragging. Slow, physical, scraped footsteps on wet asphalt, starting from the distant side of the street, making its heavy, slow journey directly toward my corner property. This time, however, I had the camera. A cheap digital recording device, a night vision model I'd picked up from a nearby big box store with a heavy lens encased in plastic. I trained the focus directly outside my house's perimeter as the sound of the slow, wet drag intensified. The camera, through its grainy night vision, captured the edge of the street, the curb, and the first few feet of my lawn under the tree canopy. And then the figure came into focus. It was the same one, tall, male, wrapped in a too heavy, archaic black greatcoat that seemed to absorb all possible light and definition around its edges, somehow making the surrounding visual noise darker wherever it was present. It wasn't walking in a normal capacity. It was shuffling, a heavy, scraping motion that was physically laborious, with an almost painful effort dedicated to each forward 3-inch movement. When it finally reached my curb, it stopped. The scraping sound disappeared, replaced by the faint, rushing sound of the torrential rain. The man then stood still, only one short, manicured lawn distance from the large oak in my backyard. Again, he slowly raised his hand, and this time, the gesture was aimed directly and unequivocally at Eugene's house. The man pointed and then froze. The gesture gave me a cold idea, an escape hatch for my logic. The thing was definitely not looking at me. It was fixating on Eugene's lawn and his house. I stared at the image frozen on my monitor. The figure was utterly disturbing, a black hole in the shape of a man's coat. Then, across the cul-de-sac, in the true, physical, actual house of my ordinary, silent neighbor, Eugene's living room light, which I had seen extinguished exactly at 11:30 p.m. for a full season, suddenly, instantly, switched to a brilliant, startling, unnatural white shine. Not a switch on, but a flare of pure, powerful incandescent light emerging from a completely dark room. The light stayed on for maybe 2 seconds, burning so hotly it was visibly brighter than the street lights on my monitor. And then it popped. The power was gone, leaving that single, large window in his house in utter, black silence, even darker than the night around it. At the exact same moment the light exploded and then immediately died. The figure outside my window dropped its arm. And then it started moving, not shuffling. It was running. A rapid, physical, aggressive scuttling motion that immediately broke the spell of its slow, labored effort. It charged not toward my house, but directly toward the quiet, dark structure of my neighbor's home. The sound of its footsteps was wrong. Too fast, too urgent, a sound that wasn't right for a man his size, like the tapping of light objects or the scrape of small knives. I instinctively grabbed my car keys, ran out of my back door, and drove the hell away, throwing the camera monitor against the side siding in my panic, not stopping until I had merged onto the open freeway, a stream of normal traffic and flashing electrical lights that promised security. I tried to rationalize it all from the safety of a motel parking lot an hour away. The entity had followed me. It came to the suburban location where I was, and finding me armed, it immediately diverted its focus to the easiest place, the 80-year-old, frail, and single occupant across the street. It hadn't come for me. It came for the light, the attention, the energy that the entire suburban structure was built on, and it had found it next door. I went back in the morning, convinced I would find either a body or a ransacked house. The police were there, blue flashing lights distorting the manicured green lawn. Eugene was gone. The medical examiner confirmed the 80-year-old man had died quietly in his sleep. Natural causes. But the police found my testimony about a dark figure outside extremely strange. I eventually told the detective everything about the voice, the strange focus, and the sudden light show at 1:30 a.m. inside Eugene's dark for decades living room. An hour later he called me back. Everything was in order, Eugene was simply gone. But the final line the detective had to say stuck with me like a cold knife deep in my gut. They checked the old man's corpse. Eugene's cause of death was officially ruled as a heart attack, probably brought on by the sudden excitement, shock, or high anxiety. But they had found something else completely inexplicable. In the palm of his fully clenched left hand, facing upward, and visibly illuminated by the flashlights of the crime scene unit, they had found 3 small, black, perfect pieces of obsidian that appeared to have been very recently cut. The dark, glassy shards were cold to the touch and showed microscopic remnants of a clear, thick, viscous liquid that still hadn't been identified. He wasn't just old. He had been touched in his final moments. I sold the house 2 weeks later. I never want to be anywhere flat, quiet, or suburban again. I know this now to be purely true. The suburban whisper wasn't a warning, it was a distraction. It was the predator letting the main target feel safe long enough for it to select and consume the easier, nearby victim. And as I drive away, my new home has no light on the horizon, only deep forest. Because the moment you find safety, the moment you are alone, that low, slow, dragging noise will return, whispering its promise not to one, but to the entire block full of silent, unaware souls. Story 10. It's an acknowledged law of the universe that the old equipment at a massive, disused industrial complex will only break down after midnight when there is a minimum amount of human attention to notice it. I was doing a contract for FEMA a couple of years back, helping to secure assets at the old Central State Electric Plant Complex, a sprawling, hideous mass of concrete and rusting steel that generated power for Central Arkansas before environmental regulations finally shut it down 2 decades ago. My job was simple: overnight security watch in a trailer near the main gate. The entire place was fenced, lit only by high-mast security lights that cast long, sickly yellow shadows, all surrounded by silence, broken only by the continuous drip of stagnant groundwater and the occasional hiss of a cooling tube letting off a tiny residual bit of steam. I was alone, content to watch the digital TV and wait for dawn. The trouble started, naturally, on a Tuesday at 2 a.m., in the middle of a completely silent, dry night. One of the old, low-intensity floodlights on the farthest side of the main boiler house, a light that illuminates an absolutely necessary set of rusted fire escapes, suddenly blinked out. It was a power failure. Just a mundane blown filament. Still, job requirements dictated an immediate walk-in check to confirm it didn't coincide with a perimeter breach. I grabbed my oversized, industrial-grade flashlight, a clipboard, and walked the 50 yards from my trailer across the massive courtyard to the first wall of the main structure. It was cold, still, and almost offensively quiet. My eyes quickly adjusted to the lower light. The exterior was fine. No broken fencing, no graffiti. So I turned around to head back, completing the bare minimum of the paperwork, intending to call the maintenance crew in the morning. And that's when I heard it. From inside the massive, abandoned, and dead main building, behind a single, gigantic steel door 10 times my body weight, a tremendous, deep sound emanated. Not a bang, not a smash, but the overwhelming clang of a thick, heavy, industrial chain suddenly dropping 40 vertical feet straight onto a polished cement floor. The sound had a horrible finality to it, echoing inside the immense structure with such persistence that I was physically sure the sound came from the core of the long-dead main reactor room itself. I dropped my flashlight for a second, my pulse suddenly redlining. Rats, high wind, structural expansion, anything but something moving a chain. I just barely whispered the thoughts in the low light. I didn't immediately call it in. I am a rational man, and I needed hard evidence. I crept back to the steel loading gate, pressing my ear against the cold metal, using my thumb to gently pull a loose piece of sealing wax off the exterior. The sound inside was different now. The movement had changed from a single, final clang to a soft, consistent, heavy drag. It sounded like a massive, rusted steel hook was being repeatedly brought a few feet forward across the cement floor and then slowly, methodically, moved back in a complex reverse action. Not a rhythmic activity, but one that changed velocity and direction as if the object being moved was too heavy for whatever was moving it. The sound was undeniably artificial, a metal-on-concrete friction that was the complete antithesis to any explanation involving wind or rodent activity. The only word for it was labored. Someone or something was inside, deliberately moving a chain-linked, metallic implement that could weigh 100 pounds. My terror finally broke into action. I fumbled for my radio, brought it to my mouth, and was about to hiss an incoherent alert when the sound inside my right ear, not from the radio, but from right outside the fence next to the steel door, made me flinch. The sound was a loud, wet cough, not a short hack, but a long, strained, wet attempt to clear one's throat after swallowing something sharp. And it was followed by a familiar, heavy sentence, delivered in a low, tired bass voice by the person who had coughed. Exactly one sentence. "We need the power to finish the job." I knew that voice. I absolutely knew it. I hadn't been friends with the men I supervised, but I knew the deep tremor, the specific, high-end crackle that accompanied one of my retired, cantankerous team leaders, a former coal miner named Earl who always complained of the plant's structural instability. I had called him on the phone exactly 8 hours prior. Earl had resigned from the post after a nervous breakdown and had moved 800 miles away. Yet, here he was, breathing heavily on the immediate other side of the high chain-link fence only 4 feet from my ear, standing with the massive, rusted steel door 20 feet behind him, and telling a terrified, unseen listener the plant needed power. I spun around, sweeping the 500-lumen beam of my torch directly where the voice had come from, over the top of the fence, and into the black area of the adjacent disused construction lot. Nothing. Not a shadow, not a footstep, not a tremor in the wire. Only a flat, empty field stretching out against the distant, sickly glare of the security lights 200 yards past. The voice was gone. The cough was gone. But behind the steel door, the laborious, heavy dragging noise was not. Only now, it was being amplified by something else, a small, but unmistakable rhythmic noise, the steady chip. 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 Of some kind of handheld tool constantly impacting the polished cement floor inside the building. Whoever had moved the heavy chain was now deliberately breaking and removing a part of the cement floor right near the interior entryway. I couldn't understand the motivation. The plant had been decommissioned. There was no metal, no treasure, no artifact worth that much sustained, clandestine effort being completed in the middle of a rainy night. Terror made me move. I raised my radio one last time, turned it fully open, and held the receiver right against the steel door. I have to record this, I thought. I have to have proof beyond a psychic break. The only thing the highly sensitive coil radio recorder picked up was a massive burst of painful static upon contact. But after 4 full seconds, with the noise slowly receding as I pulled the recorder an inch away from the surface of the door, the noise was briefly replaced by the clearest, most horrific communication I have ever received. My own voice, rushed, frantic, panting, and terrified. "Hurry, hurry! There's going to be a crack in it. The light can't get me. The light can't get me, the chain. And it cut instantly, engulfed by the full-throated roar of the dragging chain suddenly picking up speed inside the abandoned plant. No cough, no breathing, no old man. Just my frantic self, narrating a coming terror. I ran back to my trailer, slammed the locked steel bolt of the door, and jammed the safety bar I carried with me under the door. I threw the radio outside, leaving only a small light on inside. I didn't return. I didn't care about the asset. I left my post at 3 a.m., in the middle of a continuous, pounding rainstorm that had suddenly begun immediately after the voice on the radio narrated its fate. I quit the contracting gig the next day, telling the supervisor I was physically ill. Which wasn't a lie. 6 months after moving to my new apartment complex miles away in a different state, avoiding Tuesdays completely, I saw a local newspaper article that confirmed the deepest, coldest part of my fear. The final inspection was completed. They found an issue with the foundation of the old Central State Electric plant. During the routine foundation core inspections, right by the main internal loading bay door where the sound had come from, the engineers had found a strange, complex disturbance. The century-old cement foundation had a perfectly neat, 30-yard-long crack in its lower slab, a complex, branching pattern that ran vertically from the concrete floor deep into the structural element beneath it, and the width exactly matched the dimensions of a heavy, industrial-grade steel chain. They couldn't explain how it had been broken by any known means. The only explanation was sustained, focused pressure exerted right at the base of the deep foundation. The final, terrible implication was simple. Someone or something had been in that abandoned plant, moving that heavy chain and instrument not to fix the foundation, but to pull something out of it. Something that was contained and sealed beneath the plant's massive, light-suppressing structure was now released into the world on the night I ran away from the final call log. And I knew with terrible clarity that my own frantic voice in the radio told the truth. My name was on that dark, wet, industrial chain, and that whatever was using the voices had simply called back to me that final night to let me know its escape was completed. Story 11. I never liked old construction sites, the places where old infrastructure dies and something new and impersonal takes its place. This feeling of profound unease deepened when I took a final construction inspection job in downtown Tampa, Florida, on the site of the former Union Block building. This particular building had been notoriously haunted, the rumors centering on a fire in the 1920s that killed a night watchman who was simply in the wrong place. Now, the old structure was mostly rubble, cleared out for a new skyscraper, and my job as the senior safety officer required me to be there after hours, usually from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., making sure the perimeter was secure and that no materials were stolen. I was fine with the ghosts. It was the isolation and the sheer volume of darkness that eventually came to break me. The rain, a daily, dense Florida rain in the late summer, was a constant, aggressive percussion on the steel siding of the temporary office trailer I worked from. The whole site was completely dark at night, intentionally so. The city regulations made it mandatory that we cut the power to the construction yard perimeter lights except for the emergency exit signs and the high-output security lights on the surrounding structures. Inside the half-acre pit that was now the construction pit, the darkness was absolute, thick, and suffocating, all amplifying the sounds of the night itself. And there was always the persistent sound of the night watchman's rule, a slow, soft tap-tap-tapping. Always 3 taps, perfectly spaced, coming, I was certain, from underground. The site was known for its deep basement tunnels, now mostly just flooded concrete holes hidden by steel plating. Our best guess was some residual equipment that shifted in the flooded sections below the steel covering. I kept telling myself it was only water percussion, tapping against a half-submerged metal drum. Still, 3 distinct, rhythmic raps every hour. About 3 weeks into the job, the tapping had become not routine, but aggressive. It began to follow me. When I did my routine 2 a.m. check-in at the security gate at the far end of the property, the same tap-tap-tap would follow my flashlight beam, 3 soft taps coming from the sheetrock protecting the main pit area, then, 2 minutes later, moving 50 feet away and repeating the process, perfectly following the arc of my patrol. It was fast, accurate, and completely soundless except for the 3 soft tapping sounds. This wasn't water. This was something coordinated, something that knew exactly where I was. I started taking pictures immediately, pointing my phone at the areas where the sound occurred, hoping to catch some atmospheric disturbance, or even a vagrant contractor. All I got was pitch black and the reflection of the rain. The final stage came when the tapping stopped being 3 distinct taps and started introducing an unnerving rhythm, a frantic, broken ta-tap-tat. Tat. Tap-tap. It was no longer a rhythm of sound. It was an attempt at communication, a frantic language being hammered into the very foundations of the pit. On one particularly rainy night, I had retreated to the security trailer, listening to the desperate, rhythmic sound of the tapping that felt like it was only a few feet beneath my chair, waiting for the safety of the 4 a.m. daylight. The frantic rhythm had become constant. Too constant, even for my mounting terror. I realized, in a cold wave of clarity, that the rhythm being tapped was a variation of the Morse code signal for SOS. Slowed down. Rhythmic. Broken down by sheer energy drain or something attempting a communication far above its ability. Tapping, tapping, frantic. Save our souls. Help us. We are trapped. Against my better judgment, I lifted the edge of the sheet metal just by the back of my trailer, peering into the pitch-black abyss of the exposed water pit. The sound of the tapping grew so loud it was terrifying. It sounded like someone beating very rapidly on an open piece of cold steel pipe 10 feet below me. A single, distinct, sickly yellow beam from the distant street light 100 yards away managed to cut across the chasm, hitting the thick, oily, still black surface of water pooled 70 feet down. And on that surface of water, right in the center of a small, momentary disruption, I saw 2 bright, intensely wide eyes. Not the light reflecting, not the light of a small rodent. These were the wide, circular eyes of a man, eyes held open in pure, protracted panic, floating exactly 40 feet below me, looking right up at the single small gap I had created in the metal shielding. The eyes blinked, and then immediately began to cry, the tears creating wide, smooth, circular ripples that spread out in the otherwise stationary pool of black water, the single most beautiful and terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. I dropped the sheeting, slammed it back into place, and only one sound followed, the desperate, frustrated, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping immediately returned, trying in vain to escape what was holding him down so far into the flooded tunnels below. I only did one more night of work there, sitting in the trailer until 4 a.m., ignoring the relentless sound below that had finally been given a face, a tragedy, and a specific need for release. The tapping was still there, right up to the final second of the shift. The last thing I heard before switching the clock in time to complete was a familiar old man cough, mixed entirely with my own voice whispering, a final moment of absolute communication over the rhythmic tapping that shook the very ground under my feet. The night watchman's rule was not a warning, it was a permanent curse, and I swore to myself on that cold, wet morning that I would never volunteer to stand guard over the silence of the American night again. There is no quiet and buried architecture, only the screams of the lost, trapped between two layers of history and rain. Story 12. My obsession with cold calling, or rather, my job doing cold calling, is what led to the breakdown. It's a job where you isolate yourself in a small home office, working through long, exhausting lists of random numbers, trying to sell some abstract financial product to strangers. The key phrases I lived by were persistence when facing resistance, and never take no personally. But those phrases quickly became iron bars after my bizarre encounter. The rain, a constant gray curtain over my Washington State window, was the only thing grounding me. It was what made my office quiet enough for the terror to emerge. The events all center on a piece of aging, customized VoIP networking equipment I was using, specifically, a massive, blinking, black aluminum box I bought cheaply at a local government surplus auction. The whole situation started innocently. I began picking up heavy static on my home network, usually around 2 a.m., the quiet, desolate core of my work shift. Just high-frequency noise bleeding into the digital signal. My first instinct was that the cheap, old router was failing. I did a deep diagnostic check, which showed the machine was fine. But my diagnostic program did flash one strange message: high ambient static, source, analog. That made no sense. This was a purely digital network. Then came the voices. At first, I was working through the routine of calls, droning out the same script to a retired woman in Idaho, when the voice, singular, strained, and high-pitched, suddenly cracked directly into the center of my call. It was a rapid, whispered sound, completely detached from the woman's hesitant questions. It was coming from the center of the router box itself. Stop. Stop. Please stop talking to them. It was a frantic, pleading voice, repeating itself over and over with the deep urgency of fear. The person on the other end heard me pause, but not the voice. She just thought I was reading the screen. I tried to dismiss my panic and focus on the script. But the more I insisted on persistence when facing resistance, the louder, strained, and more fractured the pleading voice became inside the digital signal. They are finding them. Stop. It got worse over the next several nights. What started as simple, desperate pleading quickly devolved into a bizarre, highly focused, complex auditory phenomenon. The voices became multiple. Not 2 or 3, but an entire crowd of strained, gasping whispers and sobs, all interjected by the sound of what seemed like massive electrical surges. The static itself contained a language. It sounded like 20 people were simultaneously transmitting a frantic request to not be seen. They were trapped in the VoIP box, and the act of me connecting to a random American stranger was the physical portal through which they could find the unfortunate soul on the other end of the line. I realized with a sudden, sick clarity that my persistence was not persistence at all. It was becoming sacrificial. I was an unwilling conduit, the whisper filter through which a silent, secondary horror was broadcast. I couldn't control my mounting anxiety. Every successful number connection was now accompanied by a sharp, violent burst of electrical ozone and a deep, low groan that sounded as if some heavy, unseen, physical mass was flexing or straining. My hands would shake visibly over the keyboard as I tried to type the basic financial data while the voices screamed inside my headphones. Look outside! Your window! They are closer! They couldn't be true, but it didn't matter. The raw, auditory hysteria was crippling my ability to speak, to think, and to continue my job. I was constantly battling a wall of sound and the deep philosophical terror of knowing I was a digital predator's hunting dog. The end of my sanity came deep into a particularly miserable, rainy Friday morning. I was desperate for sleep, completing a mandatory, final, bad list. A list composed of numbers I had previously logged as "do not call." They had flagged as bad only because a previous call had erupted into sheer, incoherent profanity, or the line had gone dead with a violent sound effect. I put my headset on with a shaking sigh, trying to look past the thick, gray film covering my window. I hit the first number. Connection. Silence. And then, from the right side of the headpiece, I heard a voice, single and final, a dry, raspy, intelligent voice. Not yelling. Not begging. A voice of absolute control. Thank you for the prompt identification of the resistant host, Mr. Cole. The voice was pure, crisp, and devoid of the straining static that always protected the voices I had been hearing before. It was addressing me directly. It knew my name. I felt the instantaneous nausea of panic and grabbed the headset to yank it off my hair. But before it came off, the voices, the terrified crowd of trapped souls who begged me to stop calling, returned one final time, a single, unified, screaming chorus that obliterated my eardrums and all my remaining will as they whispered the most intimate of details. My wife's favorite scent mixed with the name of my oldest brother, whose number I had called 2 hours prior. Hurry, hurry! Now you know! Burn the wires! They screamed. Burn the wires! And then the noise was replaced by a single, loud, sickening thud. Not outside the computer box, but from directly inside it. A sound of a physical mass, something soft and wet and heavy, falling from a distance inside the black shell of the surplus router box onto a polished digital circuit board. The voices and the cold, controlled final sentence immediately went silent. My VoIP connection dropped completely, the lights on the box turning from flashing green to a dead, dark black. I slowly pulled the headset from my ears. The silence in the small office, under the constant drumming of the rain, was terrible. Just the gentle sound of the drizzle and the slow, heavy beat of my terrified heart. I didn't open the box. I didn't call maintenance. I packed the VoIP machine, the original auction sheet, the headsets, and all the wiring back into the original surplus shipping container, and I drove 80 miles in the pouring rain to the local dump, throwing it all deep into a garbage compactor and signing an immediate resignation letter for my remote sales gig on my phone. I gave up on technology, on remote connectivity, and on working alone. Why? Because the core fear was not the trap voices, which were a terrifying bonus. The core, absolute horror was the discovery of the whisper filter, the fact that my persistent, cold-calling job was the perfect delivery network. Something was using the discarded technology of the local government, a piece of surplus equipment I had cheaply purchased to chase my own American dream, a technology of digital voice and infinite networking, to hunt the elderly, the single, the disconnected, and the vulnerable, and it had found the network to do it. It had been delivering the hidden horror to them perfectly, one digital call at a time. Nothing digital in this world is truly safe now, because I know absolutely what they found when they reached the recipient on the other end of the line. Story 13. My grandpa always told me that every piece of inheritance comes with a price tag, and you never truly know what you've accepted until you try to open the final, most sealed thing. I took his advice to literally the year he died. He had been a collector of oddities from his trips, old maritime relics, tribal masks, and ancient books. Me, I was a 23-year-old in college in North Carolina, and I only cared about the small inheritance check. The vast, disorganized chaos of his possessions was left to my mother. The only thing I received was his grandma's box, a small, 6-inch black steel box, a safe, really, with an impossibly antiquated, 6-digit wheel lock. He left a note. The key is to give up. The things you are looking for right now are not the things that matter. My mother was convinced it held the codes to all his money. I was just convinced it was a piece of sentimental junk. But I quickly grew obsessed with opening it. I spent a long, boring southern summer, trapped in my dorm with only the sound of high-powered thunderstorms and the low fan hum keeping the humidity down, searching for the key or the combination code. Nothing worked. As I began my frantic, low-level drilling attempts, the box started fighting back. The resistance wasn't magical, but deeply psychological. When I would leave the small, heavy box on the center of my laminate student desk, go to the bathroom, and then return, the simple desk items around the box would suddenly look wrong. For example, my stainless steel fork, which had been perfectly straight 20 minutes ago, was now slightly bent at an almost imperceptible angle. Then, my heavy steel stapler was moved a centimeter too close to the edge of the desk. And finally, the light immediately surrounding the box became weirdly cold. And the air around it felt intensely heavy, static charged, and difficult to move through. The temperature in my room never changed, but my fingers, whenever I reached for the box in the low light of the pre-dawn hours, always went instantly numb. I finally became convinced that the lock mechanism was damaged, trapping some of the highly reactive chemical components inside the old metal casting. The night I finally decided to destroy it completely, I realized the core fear wasn't about the box contents. It was that the objects around it were disturbed for a reason. My terror was based on a simple, singular conclusion. Someone or something in my closed dormitory room knew exactly what I was doing and was physically rearranging its immediate surroundings to warn me about the act of prying open the small safe. It was mid-October, and the constant, heavy rain was now more drizzle than downpour. I brought the box to the corner farthest from my window, deep beneath a tangle of old blankets and storage luggage. My intent was simply to use a sledgehammer, delivered suddenly and quickly, thus ending the box and all this strange, psychokinetic atmosphere. I positioned the old hammer over the top of the box, took a deep, final breath, and was about to swing. I hesitated. And in the tiny, momentary silence between my breath and the final swing, I heard 3 rhythmic sounds, small, tapping noises, not coming from the center of the box, but directly from inside the old storage luggage behind the object. Tap, tap, tap. It was frantic, clear, and demanding. And it made me instantly aware that a human-sized fear was sitting silently 2 feet behind the small, locked steel box. I dropped the sledgehammer, which hit the linoleum floor with a massive clang. I ripped the storage unit apart, clearing the blankets in a frantic, desperate spray of material. And there, sitting inside the now empty, dust-covered wooden box I pulled apart, was a perfectly preserved, unblemished human spine, about 4 feet tall. It was old, certainly, a dry, antique white color, the vertebrae individually strung together with thick copper wiring and anchored at the bottom by a solid piece of granite. Clearly some sort of old museum art piece my grandfather had picked up on his travels. And it was looking at me. I am certain I screamed and scrambled backwards across the floor to the safety of the main doorway. I stared at the clean, quiet, dry spine in the middle of the dust-covered box. I didn't see an entity. I didn't see a shape. Just an artifact. But suddenly, as I stared, a terrible image of my dead grandfather, holding the fully prepared human spine in front of the box 60 years ago, forcing the metal of the lock to finally break under the sheer energy of concentration, washed over me. I finally saw it. He had to open the box to see its contents, and the things inside the box, the reason for the deep fear, had been attempting to communicate to him through the spine all along, a permanent, physical conduit of psychic transference. The box wasn't locked to keep things out. It was locked to keep the contents from being forced back onto him. The box was just a seal. The communication medium was that piece of old human bone. Suddenly, a massive, prolonged, echoing groan came from my closet, the sheer sound of effort stretching the silence of the room, followed by the sound of my personal locker, filled with heavy clothes, suddenly falling over in a thick, physical crack of noise and snapping metal. The artifact wasn't just tapped, it was infuriated. My terror was cemented there. The object had communicated with me, confirmed I was a subject, and realized I had seen the secret. The thing inside the safe was not money, but some cursed, psychic component that, when released, would immediately be attracted to the physical conduit of its spine and finally escape into the room. I scrambled up, not taking a moment to put on my shoes. I took 2 deliberate actions. I grabbed the spine and smashed it to pieces against my desk lamp with 2 rapid, terrible hits, shattering the copper wiring and granite base into a million dusty slivers of bone. Then I turned around and drove the sledgehammer into the small black box. 1 hit. No sound whatsoever. The hammer simply bounced off an unseen layer of psychic pressure, sending a profound, paralyzing wave of white heat up my arms and into my chest. The wave was followed by a brief, heavy swapping sound of deep breath emanating from both the metal box and from directly next to me in the corner of my room. The sound was too thick, too physical, too wet. Terror was my main weapon now. I grabbed the sledgehammer and the box, drove to the closest river dock, and threw both the hammer and the final, ancient curiosity as far as I could out into the deepest, central current of the water, not looking back as the black shape of the safe and the silver of the hammer were enveloped by the cold, deep water. I still have nightmares about the spine screaming. But I am physically certain about one thing. The price of my grandpa's final inheritance wasn't the thousands of dollars I'd lost in the inheritance check. It was the possibility of a lifetime connection to that curse. I destroyed the conduit of the curse and plunged the psychic trap of the safe deep under a massive, turbulent river. I only have one deep, profound existential horror now. What if the river only washed the spine clean, and the final thing that was sent back to me wasn't my name, but the long, low sound of that wet, awful swapping noise repeating itself in front of my sealed door, trying to tell me that the relic had found a new, terrible bone to speak its final message to me. I can't look at rain now without hearing the sound.